Today, in the early hours of the morning on Wednesday, the 10th of September 2025, the nation of Poland came under attack. What the fuck, Russia? You're making me get up really early. Just across the border, soldiers and civilians in western Ukraine are under heavy bombardment from Russian kamikaze drones in the latest of a long and devastating series of overnight attacks. But then, Russian drones started turning toward Poland. Not just one or two, as occasionally happened during the war, but an entire swarm of them, crossing one after another, until it was clear that this just couldn't possibly be an accident. Before long, multiple major airports across Poland were shut down, civilians in several regions were ordered to shelter in place, and Polish and NATO-allied warplanes were dropping kamikaze drones out of the sky. Over the long span of the war in Ukraine, what happened last night is entirely unprecedented, but if the Western world is honest with itself, we know exactly what this is. For years, the nations of the NATO alliance have understood that one day, sooner or later, Vladimir Putin's Russia would act to directly challenge NATO's resolve. Now, we know for certain that that day is today. Now, at first, it seemed as if the overnight hours from Tuesday the 9th until Wednesday the 10th would be a perfectly ordinary night of horrors in Eastern Europe. In Ukraine, just days removed from Russia's single largest air attack of the entire war so far, air raid sirens were sounding yet again, with Russia carrying out a predictable but terrifying sequence of events. First, the drone swarms would arrive, autonomous waves of explosive kamikaze UAVs that were most likely built in Russia, but typically based on an Iranian design, the Shahed 136. Those drones would fly slowly across Ukraine until they finally reached their targets, all the while waiting for air defenses to roar to life and bring them down. Once the air defenses were engaged, Russian strategic bombers would release their payloads, long-range missiles that can travel far faster. If Russia's attacks work as intended, those missiles will arrive just as Ukrainian air defenses are struggling to replenish interceptor rockets fast enough to deal with these swarms of drones overhead, substantially raising the chance that missiles, the actual projectiles Russia wants to score hits, will be able to break through to their targets. But at about 1:15 in the morning local time, several Russian drones started flying even further west, past any targets in Ukraine, and eventually past the border entirely. Online, war observer accounts and open-source intelligence analysts on social media picked up on the problem, unable to come to any hard conclusions about what had happened, but observing that whatever it was almost certainly bad news. Also on social media, scattered reports, audio and even video began to trickle in from Poland, indicating that fighter jets had been scrambled and were moving all across the country's east. A major airport was announced as closed, and then another, and then two more after that, including two airports that serve Warsaw. And to be clear, Warsaw is not close to the Ukrainian border, indicating the depth of territorial penetration that these drones achieved. Global flight tracking services showed multiple military aircraft active over Polish territory, an air-to-air refueler from the NATO fleet circling the same route, a Polish early warning and control plane, also doing loops but moving progressively deeper into Polish territory as if it were tracking incoming threats. And for just a few minutes, an F-35 fighter jet, marked as being from the US Air Force, although possibly Dutch, that turned on its transponder and squawked a code that indicated that it had lost communication. Fighter jets were reported in more and more locations, while other routes seemed to indicate that drones might have crossed over Moldova or even Russian-friendly Slovakia, although hard confirmation from Moldova has not been announced as at the time of writing. For a span of a couple of hours, it wasn't clear whether the incident was an international provocation from Russia or possibly an accident. For a single group of drones to experience some kind of malfunction and then drift into Polish airspace or be guided there erroneously by their onboard systems wasn't likely, but it was not also out of the realm of possibility. Russian mill bloggers, usually quite active during Russia's air assaults, suddenly fell silent, raising suspicions that perhaps this wasn't part of the plan, or at the very least it hadn't been communicated to them beforehand. A group of Russian strategic bombers already in flight to release their cruise missiles appeared to turn back, as if they had received sudden orders to abort their mission. And for those drones to cross over Slovakia in particular, suggested a possibly unintentional act, since Slovakia's leaders are among Russia's few connections in Europe that are still relatively cordial. Not to mention, while the open source world was buzzing, major news outlets were almost completely absent in the coverage. Perhaps this was all a whole lot of nothing. But then a second group of drones crossed into Polish airspace, and even more after that. Soon the major outlets had picked up on the story. Polish officials, as well as a couple of American legislators, were referencing the presence of hostile objects in Polish airspace. By dawn, Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk had confirmed the, quote, downing of drones that intruded into our airspace and could have posed a threat. Polish defense leaders confirmed that fighter aircraft had actively engaged multiple targets, meaning shot them down, while shelter-in-place orders were issued for several regions in the east. Poland's Territorial Defense Force issued a mass warning to its service members in the country's east, indicating that they could be called up on as little as 6 hours' notice. Also indicated that it was in, quote, constant contact with NATO commands and that air defenses and radar reconnaissance would be shifted to their highest possible state of readiness. According to the Polish Armed Forces, soldiers are working actively to find the crash sites of downed drones, and as of sunrise on Wednesday the 10th, the drone attacks appear to have stopped, for now at least in Poland. Meanwhile in Ukraine, those Russian strategic bombers that appeared to have turned around had apparently changed their minds, unleashing a massive wave of up to 40 cruise missiles in the small hours of the morning. At the time of writing, the damage from those strikes is yet to be assessed. Now, as we said at the outset of the episode today, if Poland and its NATO's allies are honest with themselves, there is only one way to interpret what just happened over Polish territory. Vladimir Putin had issued a test to the NATO alliance to see how NATO will respond to what was a brazen, coordinated overflight by numerous explosive kamikaze drones over the territory of a NATO member state. Remember, this sort of incident is entirely unprecedented in Poland or any other NATO member nation since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Polish airports have never had to shut down, NATO fighter aircraft have never had to be scrambled to intervene, and Polish civilians have never had to shelter in place entire regions at a time because of a danger from Russian kamikaze drones. But it's precisely the kind of attack that Western analysts have expected from Russia for years. Eventually, Russia was going to do something that would send tensions with NATO skyrocketing in order to see whether the alliance's leaders would find their spines and stand up to him, or whether they'd roll over, as they've done so many times before. And if they do roll over, then Putin can assume that there will be no NATO collective response to the next, even more brazen act of aggression by Russia, or the next after that, or the next after that. As for what the NATO alliance could do in the wake of what appears to have been a planned attack, that's difficult to say for sure. It's unlikely that Poland will invoke NATO's Article 5 provision of collective defense and ask that the whole of NATO join it in a conflict with Russia, considering that nobody appears to have died in Poland because of the drone wave, and Russia still has some veneer of plausible deniability. Some. But there are a whole lot of steps that Poland and the NATO alliance can take without having to invoke Article 5. For one thing, Poland can invoke Article 4, which would allow it to request consultations with alliance members over threats to its, quote, territorial integrity, political independence, or security, and beyond mere discussions, Poland and its NATO allies can take action. That action could involve transforming Polish airspace into a buzzing beehive of NATO air patrols, deploying troops on the ground to protect Polish territory in the nearby Baltic states, or otherwise positioning NATO assets much closer to the front. It could also involve NATO member nations, either acting through the alliance or through smaller coalitions, seeking to respond or retaliate in some way, possibly by taking direct action in the war in Ukraine. As an example, a rather restrained way to do that would be to help shoot down incoming drones the next time Russia attacks the western part of the country near NATO airspace. A rather less restrained way would be to launch a strike against a Russian target, perhaps in the Donbass, Crimea, or another part of occupied Ukraine, so that the strike wouldn't be read as a direct attack on Russian sovereign territory. Technically, a retaliation could include a strike on Russian sovereign territory, but let's be real, that response would be next to impossible coming from this NATO alliance to deal with this incident. Whatever NATO chooses, it will need to act fast, and more importantly, it will need to act. These sorts of Russian probing actions, they're not new. Russia tests the limits of its adversaries all the time, whether by skirting sanctions, engaging in assassinations or sabotage across the global west, conducting small-scale military acts to test the waters before a larger planned escalation, or acting through mercenaries and unmarked, unidentified troops. As malevolent as those actions may be, they're also a form of data collection. Russia provides a stimulus, it measures a reaction, and it uses the resulting observations to decide on a course of action. The response of Poland and its NATO allies will determine everything about where this conflict goes next, and whether the data that comes back from Putin's probing attack against NATO either tells him to back down or push ahead. And make no mistake, while this attack is almost certainly an attempt to judge the response of NATO, it is an attack that was ultimately performed for an audience of one. NATO's Article 5 commitments will rest on the United States, despite Europe's recent efforts to change the game, and right now the very arc of history will bend around Donald Trump's choice in this very moment. Despite any talk of peace, Vladimir Putin and his military have made their intentions abundantly clear. From January 2023 until October of 2024, before Trump was elected, there wasn't a single instance where Russia had launched over 2,000 missiles and drones in the span of 1 month. In November, when Trump was elected, and in January, when he was inaugurated, Russia crossed that 2,000 projectile threshold repeatedly. In February, March, and May of this year, it was over 4,000. In June, over 5,000. In July, over 6,000. And between August, after Trump's Alaska summit, and September thus far, Russia has launched some of the largest air assaults of the entire war, including the largest, with well over 800 projectiles launched in a single night this past Sunday. Despite the rhetoric, it's the numbers that matter. And by the numbers, Vladimir Putin does not see Trump as a reason to scale down his military operations. Precisely the opposite, in fact. And now Putin has provided Trump and NATO with the ultimate test, the clear provocation of the NATO alliance that the world has anticipated for years. America's decision in this moment may prove pivotal. And up until now, the behavior of Trump and his allies toward Russia does not suggest that America will make a stand. And look, here at WarFronts, we are under no illusions about the limitations of our reach, but to the extent that we have any voice at all, we would be remiss not to use it on a day that will become a pivot point in history, no matter which way history goes from here. This is the moment. This is when all of Europe's talk about finding its spine has to result in action. This timing wasn't a mistake. France's government just collapsed. Unrest in Britain is climbing. Global trust in America among its allies is dropping rapidly, and the world is distracted by yesterday's Israeli strike against the sovereign nation of Qatar. It's time to assume that America is not coming. After it failed to punish Putin for his ceasefire charade, and failed to punish him for striking the British Council and the European Union officers in Kiev just last week, Russia is going to claim that this was an accident. It'll deny, it'll minimize, it will redirect blame. But the rest of the nations of NATO, the nations of Europe, must respond to this attack on the premise that it was entirely intentional. Those same NATO nations have been in agreement for years. Russia was always going to try something like this, and when it did, NATO would have to be ready. Now that day's arrived, and although Europe is nowhere near as ready as it wants to be, its leaders would have to be brain dead to believe that Russia would wait until Europe had grown strong. Europe has to act now. It has to act decisively under imperfect conditions with the tools at its disposal, because if it fails to do so, well, the war for the future of Europe is going to become inevitable, isn't it? Thank you for watching. Get out, man. What the Russia? What the